verse 4 says, he had to pass through Samaria. Bill, you're going to be really happy this morning. I have like 6 maps for you, okay? Here's Galilee, here's Judea, and right in the middle lays the land of Samaria. And the quickest route to go from Judea to Galilee is through Samaria. You're like, so what, Kyle? What's the big deal about that? I mean, they don't have any drive-through McDonald's on the way? Like, why is it such a big deal to go through Samaria? Well, there's an important historical background. If you recall from the Old Testament, there was a time when the nation of Israel only had one king, right? They were all united under King David and then his son Solomon. But after Solomon died, the kingdom split under the reign of Rehoboam. So Rehoboam, he would rule in, let me see if I got here. Rehoboam, he would rule in Judah in the south, where Jeroboam ruled in the kingdom of Israel in the north. Jerusalem remained the capital of the south, and they went through different capitals up in Israel, but it finally settled in a city called Samaria. Samaria. And Samaria will become so prominent as a city in identifying the northern kingdom that the Bible often just refers to Samaria to talk about the entire region. For all of you teenagers on summer break, remember metonymy, right? You're like, don't talk to me about that. So this is a part for the whole. It becomes so associated with it. And here's an example of this. 1 Kings 13. For the message he declared by the word of the Lord against the altar in Bethel and against all the shrines of the high places, look at this, in the towns of Samaria. Technically speaking, Samaria is just one town, but it began to dominate the region. Now, a couple of other important things to know about Samaria. When the kingdom split, the city of Jerusalem is in the south. Here's why that's so problematic. Because the temple of God is in Jerusalem. And so if you are in the north and you want to keep the festivals and come for atonement, that would mean you would have to go to the south. Well, the king in the north didn't like this. So he builds idols. You can kind of see them marked up there in the top, Dan. And you have them see marked down here, Bethel, so that the people would not go back to the temple because he was worried they would give allegiance to the southern kingdom. But of course, this leads to idolatry. It corrupts Samaritan worship and practice. Not only this, the Samaritans had to revisit the Bible because there's parts of the Bible that would lead them to worship in Jerusalem. For example, in Deuteronomy 12, it says, you shall seek the place the Lord your God will choose out of all the tribes, which would be Judah, to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go. Now, for those of us who accept the Old Testament as true, that would lead the people to Jerusalem, recognizing that it was in the tribe of Judah that God wanted to set up his temple. But as residents of the northern tribes, the Samaritans cannot interpret this verse this way. And so what do? Here's what they did. They rejected the entire Old Testament outside of the first 5 books of the Bible. We're only going to accept the first 5 books, the Torah, the Pentateuch. And then they're going to reinterpret these passages to talk about different shrines. So you have what's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. By the way, there's actually still Samaritans alive today who follow these teachings. Okay? And so the Samaritan Pentateuch is almost the same as ours, the first 5 books of the Bible, except for in a couple of key places. They are going to reinterpret where is the place of worship, because for them it's not going to be in Jerusalem, it's going to be at Mount Gerizim. For example, like in Deuteronomy 7:4, they change the name from Mount Ebal to Mount Gerizim. They try to keep making this the place of blessing, since this is where Moses read was a place of blessing. So a couple of verses like this, they will take and change it. They don't believe in the prophets of the Old Testament. They don't believe in Daniel or Isaiah or Jeremiah. They reject the Davidic kingship. They don't believe that the Messiah is going to be a descendant of King David. Now, Samaria still has a concept of a Messiah, but it's like what we talked about last week. It's the Deuteronomy 18 Messiah. There's going to be a prophet like Moses someday. And so in Samaritan teaching, they are looking for this great prophet who will arise at the end of the age, and he will explain all things to God's people. He'll be the restorer. He'll restore Israel. He'll restore teachings of the Torah. Now again, I know many of you kind of have read through your Bible, and so you know that eventually there's this war, right? There's wars between the north and the south, and in the north they will eventually be overrun by the Assyrian Empire. Assyria is the purple, and then the green is everything they take over, which is like pretty much the whole known world. So Assyria takes over Israel in 722 BC, and when the Assyrian tribe takes them over, they do something. In order to make sure that population doesn't come back to prominence, they send their population to intermarry with the people. The functional effect of this is this. They're not pure ethnic Jews anymore in Israel. They're half-breeds. They're half Assyrian, and they're half Jewish. Their bloodlines get all mixed up. And so when the Jews get taken over in the south, they don't get taken over by Assyria, but Babylon. Babylon has a much different foreign policy. They will take the best and brightest leaders and bring them to Babylon and make them work for them in their kingdoms to kind of rule over these regions. But when the Judeans come back to the land after the exile, they come back to rebuild the temple. And there they find the Samaritans. They're no longer pure Israelites. They've been corrupted. They're kind of half Assyrian, they're half Israeli, and the tension begins to build. They don't follow the one true God. And so when the Jews are trying to rebuild their temple, what are the Samaritans doing? They are actively trying to stop them. There's this bad guy in the Old Testament named Sanballat. He is a Samaritan. He is trying to stop them from rebuilding the temple. And this tension begins to escalate. So much so that we see these writings, like, for example, the Sirach. It's not in the Bible. It's during this apocryphal period. But this is what the Jews say about the Samaritans. There's two nations my soul detests, and the third is not even a people. Those who live in Seir, Edom, and the Philistines. Those are the ones my soul detests. The third that's not even a people, the foolish people that live in Shechem. In other words, the Samaritans. After this intense period of fighting between the two, Israel in the south, or the Jews in the south, they are taken over by the Greeks for a while, the whole region. You know, this guy Alexander the Great, he takes over the world. But eventually they break free. And for about, about 100 years, about 50 years, they have the Hasmonean dynasty. Israel is a free nation. Judah is a free nation. And during this period, they will go up to the Samaritans, war against them, and they will burn the Samaritan temple in Gerizim to the ground. So you can imagine how that makes the Samaritans feel about the Jews. And so what happens is, as we get to the first century, as we get to the time of Christ, the Jews and the Samaritans hate each other. The Samaritans are half-breeds. They have a corrupt religion. They're heretics. They're trying to lead people astray. And so, if possible, the Jews would do what they could to avoid walking through the land of Samaria. Now, it's true the quickest route was straight through the middle, but if you could avoid it, you go on the outside. That's called the Perean Road, on the outside, that red road, so you could walk around Samaria so you wouldn't have to even go through it and talk to the people and become unclean. But here in John 4, Jesus says he had to pass through Samaria. I mean, literally in the Greek it says it was necessary. And we think, well, yeah, I guess if, you want to get there the quickest way. But here's the problem. Where was Jesus in John chapter 3? It tells us, right? He was in the Judean countryside baptizing. He's alongside the Jordan River. The quickest route for Jesus at that point is actually to take this road on the red. That's the quickest way to Samaria. But for Jesus, it was necessary for him to go through Samaria. Jesus didn't need to go through Samaria because it was the only route. He didn't need to go through Samaria because it was the quickest route. Jesus needed to go through Samaria because he had a divine appointment there.